She thought playing dead was the best way to survive a mob hit. She was wrong. Playing deaf was safer, until the most dangerous man in the city walked up to her, stared right through her panicked lie, and quietly started signing his threats. The silence just got deafening. The diner smelled of stale fry grease and cheap bleach. Nora stood behind the counter, a damp rag in her hand, watching the rain drag dirt down the front window. It was 3 a.m. The neon sign outside buzzed with a faulty wire, a persistent hum that set her teeth on edge. There were no customers, just the hum, the rain, and the clatter of the cook dropping a pan in the back. Then the bells above the door violently jingled. Nora didn't look up immediately. She wiped a coffee ring off the laminate wood, preparing her standard greeting. Before she could speak, the heavy thud of a body hitting the linoleum echoed through the narrow space. She froze. Her eyes flicked up. 3 men stood in the entryway. The one on the floor was bleeding onto the cracked tiles, gasping. The man standing over him didn't look like a thug. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Nora made in 3 years. His overcoat was soaked from the rain. He had sharp, tired features, dark hair brushed back, and a face completely devoid of expression. This was Gabriel Rossi. Everyone in the lower wards knew his face, though mostly from whispered warnings rather than newspaper clippings. You didn't look at Rossi. You didn't speak to him. Nora dropped the rag. The wet cloth slapped against the floorboards behind the counter. Gabriel's head snapped toward her. The 2 men behind him instantly reached into their jackets. Nora stopped breathing. Her chest tightened so painfully she thought her ribs might crack. She was trapped. The exit was past them. The kitchen was 15 feet away, but the swinging door was propped open, and the cook was nowhere to be seen. Probably already out the alley door. Smart man. Gabriel stepped over the gasping man on the floor. He walked toward the counter. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. He stopped right across from her, leaning over the laminate. He smelled of rain, expensive cedar, and something metallic. "How much did you hear?" Gabriel asked. His voice was a low rasp. Quiet. Not angry. Just observant. Nora's mind short-circuited. If she said nothing, she was a witness. If she said everything, she was a liability. The man on the floor groaned, a wet, rattling sound. Nora's eyes darted to him, then back to Gabriel. Panic is a feral thing. It overrides logic. She lifted a trembling hand, pointed to her ear, and shook her head. Gabriel narrowed his eyes. The diner was dead quiet, save for the rain. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at her. Nora kept her face completely slack, mimicking the vacant confusion she often saw on the faces of people who had missed a punchline. She tapped her ear again, mouthing the word, "deaf." Gabriel tilted his head. He reached into his coat. Nora's stomach plummeted. She braced for a bullet. Instead, he pulled out a heavy steel lighter. He flipped it open, the metallic clink ringing sharp in the quiet room. He lit a cigarette, took a drag, and then, without breaking eye contact with her, he dropped the heavy steel lighter directly onto the glass cake stand on the counter. The glass shattered instantly. The noise was explosive, a deafening crash just inches from Nora's face. Every instinct in her body screamed to flinch, to jump back, to cover her face. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. She forced her shoulders to stay down. She let her eyes widen in a delayed reaction, jumping only when the physical shards of glass sprayed against her apron. She looked at the broken glass, then up at him, panting slightly, performing the perfect picture of a woman startled entirely by visual movement. Gabriel exhaled a stream of smoke. The hard lines around his mouth softened marginally. He looked over his shoulder at his men. "She's deaf," Gabriel said. "Leave her." One of the men frowned. "You sure, boss?" "We were loud." I dropped a quarter-pound of steel onto glass a foot from her face, Gabriel muttered. She didn't blink until the shrapnel hit her. She didn't hear a thing. He turned back to Nora. He reached into his pocket and tossed a thick roll of bills onto the counter, right next to the ruined cake stand. He pointed to the money. Then he pointed to the door. Nora didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat from the hook, grabbed the cash, and walked out the back door into the pouring rain. She didn't look back. She didn't stop walking until she was 3 miles away, locked in her tiny apartment, shaking so violently she could barely turn the deadbolt. She had survived. She told a ridiculous, desperate lie, and it worked. She thought that would be the end of it. She thought the mob would clear out the body, leave the cash, and forget the nameless deaf waitress. She was wrong. The lie hadn't saved her. It had only changed the terms of her captivity. 2 days later, Nora returned to the diner. The glass was cleaned up. The floor was mopped. The manager didn't ask questions. He just handed her an apron. At 8 p.m., the door chimed. Gabriel Rossi walked in. Alone. He bypassed the empty booths and sat at the counter directly in Nora's section. He didn't order. He just sat there, his dark eyes tracking her every movement as she poured coffee for a pair of truckers at the other end. Nora's hands were slick with sweat. She kept her eyes averted. She couldn't hear him, she reminded herself. She couldn't hear the clinking of his spoon against the ceramic mug. She couldn't hear his boots scraping against the bar stool. She walked past him. He didn't try to get her attention. He just watched her. This became the routine. Every night, Gabriel came in. Sometimes he sat for 20 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. He conducted business in the back booths, speaking in hushed, lethal tones with men who looked like they broke bones for a living. And Nora had to serve them. She had to walk up to the table while a man described how he disposed of a vehicle, pour his coffee, and pretend the world was completely silent. It was a special kind of psychological torture. A month passed. The exhaustion of the lie began to grind Nora down to the bone. Playing deaf wasn't just about ignoring words. It meant policing every involuntary reflex her body possessed. When a bus backfired on the street outside, she couldn't jump. When a customer dropped a fork behind her, she couldn't turn. When someone shouted her name from the kitchen, she had to keep walking until they tapped her shoulder. She walked through the world in a state of hypervigilance, her muscles perpetually tense, waiting for a noise she was legally required to ignore. Her headaches were constant. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she should just run. But Gabriel's men were always around the neighborhood now. They weren't exactly following her, but they were present. The Rossi family had claimed the territory, and with it they had claimed her. She was their favorite waitress, the safe one, the invisible one. She learned too much. She learned about the shipment coming into the eastern docks on Thursdays. She learned that a man named Coyle was skimming off the top of the Rossi ledgers. She learned that Gabriel drank his coffee, Black hated the smell of bleach, and had a slight limp in his left leg when it rained. He remained an enigma. Brutal, certainly. She had seen him backhand a lieutenant so hard, the man spit teeth onto the diner floor. She had scrubbed the blood off the tile while they continued their meeting. She didn't flinch then, either. But Gabriel was also strange. He started leaving things for her. A new coat draped over her stool in the break room when the heater broke. Expensive imported tea left on the counter. He never handed them to her directly. He just made sure they were there. Nora hated it. She hated the way his dark, heavy gaze felt on her spine. She hated that she was starting to recognize the rhythm of his breathing. It was a Tuesday night, closing time. The diner was empty, except for the two of them. The neon sign was finally fixed, leaving the room in a dim, stable glow. Nora was wiping down the espresso machine. Her back was to the room. Gabriel sat at the counter. He had been quiet all night. Too quiet. Nora felt the familiar prickle of awareness on the back of her neck. He was looking at her. She turned a dish towel in hand, keeping her face perfectly blank. Gabriel wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. He raised his own hands, resting his elbows on the counter. He held her gaze. And then slowly, his fingers began to move. He formed a shape with his right hand index finger, pointing up the others curled. He tapped his chin, then moved his hand forward. Then he brought his hands together, intertwining his fingers, pulling them apart. Nora's breath hitched. She forced a look of mild, polite confusion. Inside her mind was screaming. He was signing. It wasn't perfect. It was stiff, the gestures blocky and deliberate, like a man who had spent hours practicing in front of a mirror. But it was unmistakable. You. Look. Tired. Nora stared at his hands. She had learned American Sign Language when she was 8 years old. Her younger brother Leo had lost his hearing after a severe fever. For 10 years before Leo passed away, ASL was the primary language in her house. It was a language of comfort, of home. Seeing it on the hands of a mob boss felt like a violation. She couldn't respond. If she signed back fluently, it would be suspicious. A poor deaf diner waitress wouldn't necessarily have perfect ASL grammar, but she shouldn't look at it like it was alien. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then raised her hands. Her fingers felt stiff, resisting the familiar motions. Work. Long. Hours, she signed back, keeping her movements simple, slightly abbreviated. Gabriel watched her hands intently. He didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed. He nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. He flipped it open to a bookmarked page. Nora caught a glimpse of pencil sketches, diagrams of hand shapes, arrows indicating movement. He looked at the book, then looked back at her. He raised his hands again. I. Learn. For. You. Nora felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her ribs. This wasn't a game to him. He was a man who optimized everything, a man who eradicated inefficiencies. A deaf waitress he needed to communicate with was a problem to be solved. So Gabriel Rossi was solving it. Why Nora signed, unable to stop herself. The gesture was sharp, defensive. Gabriel paused. He didn't look at his book this time. He looked directly into her eyes, his dark gaze pinning her to the spot. Because you do not lie. The bitter irony of the statement almost made Nora laugh out loud. She was nothing but a lie. Her entire existence in his world was built on a foundation of absolute pathetic deception. She swallowed hard, breaking eye contact. She grabbed the coffee pot, pretending to check the level. Her hands were shaking so badly the glass rattled against the heating plate. When she turned back around, Gabriel was standing. He tossed his usual roll of bills onto the counter. He didn't sign goodbye. He just turned and walked out into the night, the bell chiming a cheerful dismissal behind him. Nora stood frozen behind the counter. The trap had been slowly closing around her for weeks, but tonight she heard the steel jaws snap shut. He was learning her language, or rather the language she had claimed as her own. Soon he wouldn't just be signing simple phrases. He would ask complex questions. He would expect detailed answers. He would eventually realize that her syntax was perfect, that her comprehension was native. And Gabriel Rossi was not a man who forgave being made a fool. She looked at the empty diner, the rain picking up outside again. Running was no longer an option. He was paying attention now. She had to become deaf, truly flawlessly deaf, before he figured out the silence was just a script. By late November, the diner felt less like a cage and more like a confessional. Gabriel's ASL improved with terrifying speed. He approached the language the same way he approached his empire, with ruthless, systematic dedication. He no longer needed his leather-bound notebook. His hands, rough and calloused, moved with a jarring grace. He didn't just learn vocabulary, he learned the syntax, the facial expressions, the spatial grammar. He started coming in later, long after the heavy hitters and street-level enforcers had gone to bed. It would just be the two of them, the hum of the refrigerators, and the bitter smell of burnt coffee. City. Quiet. Now he signed one Tuesday, leaning against the counter. His suit jacket was off, revealing a dark holster strapped over his white shirt. Nora wiped down the pie case. Never quiet, she signed back. Always. Something. Moving. Gabriel watched her hands, then her face. You. See? Everything he signed. Good. Trait. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. Nora swallowed the lump in her throat and turned away. She hated how much she looked forward to these hours. She hated that she was learning the man beneath the monster. He didn't talk about his work. He never signed about the shipments, the violence, or the money. Instead, he signed about the stray dog that slept near his warehouse. He signed about his grandmother, a fierce woman who used to hit his knuckles with a wooden spoon when he stole figs. He signed his memories, handing them to her, like fragile glass ornaments, trusting her to hold them, because he believed she existed in a silent, isolated bubble. He was lonely. The most feared man in the city was suffocating in his own power, and he had found solace in a woman he thought was fundamentally disconnected from his world. The guilt was becoming a physical ache in Nora's chest. Every time she nodded, every time she smiled at a clumsy sign, she was driving another nail into her own coffin. If he ever found out, she heard the desperate, ragged way he exhaled when he thought she wasn't looking, he would kill her. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday. The rain had turned to sleet, rattling against the diner windows like handfuls of gravel. The manager had sent the cook home early. Nora was alone in the front when the bells violently jingled. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a heavy, wet parka. The hood was pulled up. Nora didn't need to hear his heavy, squelching footsteps to know something was wrong. His posture was rigid. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the back booth and slid into the vinyl seat facing the door. 10 minutes later, Gabriel arrived. He shook the sleet from his umbrella and walked to the counter, taking his usual stool. He didn't check the room. He was comfortable here. Too comfortable. Cold Gabriel signed a slight, rare smile, touching the corners of his mouth. He rubbed his hands together. Coffee. Black. Please. Nora reached for the pot. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She couldn't see the man in the parka from her angle, but she could hear him. The faint squeak of his wet boots shifting under the table. The heavy, measured rhythm of his breathing. She poured Gabriel's coffee. The mug clinked softly against the saucer. Gabriel picked it up, taking a slow sip. He set it down and raised his hands. You. Look. Pale. Sick, Nora forced a shake of her head. Tired, she signed. Behind Gabriel, the leather of the back booth groaned. The man was standing up. Nora's eyes remained locked on Gabriel's face. She couldn't look past him. A deaf person wouldn't know someone was approaching from behind unless they saw a shadow or felt a vibration. The lighting in the diner threw no shadows forward. Then she heard it. It was a sharp, metallic clack, the sound of a heavy-caliber handgun slide being pulled back and released, chambering around. It was unmistakable. It cut through the hum of the refrigerators and the rattle of the sleet like a scythe. Gabriel was still looking at her, his hands coming up to sign something else. He hadn't heard it over the clatter of the sleet against the glass. He was completely exposed. Nora had a fraction of a second to make a choice. Stay silent, maintain the lie and watch him die, or react, save his life, and forfeit her own. She didn't think. She let her eyes dart past Gabriel, locking on to the silver reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine behind him. It was a flimsy excuse for a visual cue, but it was all she had. She didn't shout a warning. She let out a guttural, terrifying shriek, the kind of raw, uncalibrated noise a deaf person might make when stripped of language. Simultaneously, she lunged over the counter, grabbing the heavy, scalding glass coffee pot, and hurled it blindly over Gabriel's shoulder. Gabriel's survival instincts were terrifying. He didn't look back to see what she was screaming at. The moment her face twisted in terror, he dropped. He slid off the stool, pulling his own weapon from his shoulder holster in a single fluid motion before his knees even hit the floor. The coffee pot shattered against the assassin's chest. Boiling liquid and glass exploded across the aisle. The assassin roared in pain, his shot going wide. The bullet shattered the pie case, sending shards of acrylic and pulverized pastry raining down on Nora's head. Gabriel fired twice from the floor. The reports were deafening, a concussive force that shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. The assassin slammed backward into the booth, sliding down the vinyl, leaving a thick smear of crimson in his wake. Nora was crouched behind the counter, her hands clamped over the back of her neck. Her ears were ringing with a high, piercing whine. The smell of burnt powder and vaporized coffee filled the air, sharp and suffocating. Silence descended on the diner heavier than ever before. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. She had saved him. But as she heard the slow, deliberate crunch of Gabriel's boots walking around the counter toward her, she knew the real danger had just begun. The diner was a wreck. Acrid smoke hung in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Gabriel didn't look at the body. He stepped behind the counter, holstering his weapon. He reached down and grabbed Nora by the upper arms, hauling her to her feet. His grip was bruising his dark eyes, scanning her face, her neck, her arms for bullet holes. Finding none, he let out a harsh, ragged breath. He pulled her against his chest. Nora froze. His heart was slamming against his ribs, a frantic, heavy rhythm that matched her own. He smelled of cordite and rain. For a terrifying moment, she allowed herself to lean into him, her hands hovering awkwardly over his back. Gabriel pulled away his face, unreadable. He pointed to the back room, his gesture sharp and commanding. "Go." Nora stumbled into the break room. She sat on the plastic crate, staring at her blood-speckled apron. Minutes later, the heavy metal security shutters at the front of the diner slammed down. The deadbolt clicked. Gabriel walked into the break room. He took off his suit jacket, tossing it onto the table. His white shirt was soaked with blood on the left side. A bullet had grazed his shoulder, tearing a jagged line through the meat. He sat in the folding chair under the flickering fluorescent light. He pointed to the first aid kit mounted on the wall, then to his shoulder. Nora stood up. Her legs felt like water. She retrieved the kit, snapped on latex gloves, and stepped up to him. She unbuttoned his shirt, peeling the ruined fabric back from his skin. The wound wasn't deep, but it was messy. She worked in complete silence. She cleaned the torn flesh with antiseptic. Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stared straight ahead at the cinder block wall. The silence was suffocating. Nora's mind was racing, trying to reconstruct the last 5 minutes. Did she act too fast? Was the reflection in the espresso machine enough? Did he buy it? She finished bandaging the shoulder, taping the gauze down tightly. She took a step back, pulling off the latex gloves. Gabriel didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the blank wall. The reflection in the chrome was good, Gabriel said. His voice was a low, gravelly murmur. It wasn't angry. It was terrifyingly calm. Nora stopped breathing. Her hands froze midway to the trash can. She forced herself not to turn around. She had to pretend she hadn't heard him. She had to hold the line. Gabriel slowly turned his head. He looked at her back, but the angle was wrong. He continued speaking to the back of her head, his voice barely above a whisper. From where you were standing, the machine reflects the cash register, not the back booth. You couldn't see him. Nora's chest tightened until black spots danced in the corners of her vision. She forced herself to walk to the sink. She turned on the faucet, washing her bare hands, staring blindly down the drain. "You didn't see him," Gabriel said, the sound of his boots scraping against the linoleum as he stood up. "You heard him rack the slide." He stepped up behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could feel his quiet, contained fury. He reached past her and turned off the faucet. The sudden absence of running water made the room feel as small as a coffin. Gabriel stepped to the side, forcing himself into her line of sight. He looked down at her. He didn't raise his hands to sign. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice, a dark, resonant rumble. Nora kept her eyes locked on the stainless steel sink. A tear broke loose, tracking hotly down her cheek. Gabriel reached out, hooking a finger under her chin. He tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his eyes. His gaze was burning, stripping away every defense she had left. "Tell me," Gabriel whispered the words, hitting her like physical blows. "Tell me you didn't hear a goddamn word I've said to you these past 4 months. The lie was dead. It had bled out on the floor alongside the assassin. Nora's lips parted. Her throat was painfully dry. She hadn't spoken a word in his presence in 1/3 of a year. When her voice finally broke the silence, it was raspy, fractured, and thick with tears. "If I told you I could hear," she whispered, her voice shaking, "you would have killed me." Gabriel stared at her. The sound of her voice seemed to physically strike him. The muscle in his jaw feathered. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes, digesting the absolute tragic truth of her statement. She was right. 4 months ago, if she had spoken, she would be buried in the foundation of his new warehouse. And now? He asked, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into something raw and unguarded. "Why break it now?" "Because—" Nora choked out a sob, finally tearing from her throat. "Because I couldn't let him kill you." Gabriel's expression fractured. The cold, calculating mob boss vanished, leaving behind a man who had spent 4 months baring his soul to a woman he thought lived in silence, only to find out she had heard every single beat of his heart. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't yell. Instead, Gabriel lifted his unwounded arm. He slid his hand into her hair, gripping the back of her neck, and pulled her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing shaky and ragged. "You foolish, brave liar," he murmured against her skin, the vibration of his voice traveling straight into her bones. He held her there in the fluorescent hum of the break room, the wreckage of his world waiting just beyond the door. The lie was over. The silence was broken. But as his arms tightened around her, Nora realized that the truth was going to be vastly more dangerous. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was his, and Gabriel Rossi protected what belonged to him loud and clear. The silence finally broke, but the danger is just beginning. Gabriel knows her secret, and now Nora is pulled directly into the crosshairs of a ruthless underworld. Will their twisted foundation of lies survive the war coming to Gabriel's doorstep? If this intense, slow-burn revelation gave you chills, hit that like button and share. this video with your fellow dark romance addicts. Don't forget to subscribe to catch the explosive next chapters. What do you think Gabriel will do next? Tell us in the comments.